In the 18th and most of the 19th centuries, a sloop-of-war in the Royal Navy was a warship with a single gun deck that carried up to 18 guns. As the rating system covered all vessels with 20 guns and above, this meant that the term sloop-of-war actually encompassed all the unrated combat vessels, including the very small gun brigs and cutters. In technical terms, even the more specialized bomb vessels and fire ships were classed as sloops of war, and in practice these were actually employed in the sloop role when not carrying out their specialized functions. In World War I and World War II, the Royal Navy reused the term sloop for specialized convoy defense vessels, including the Flower class of World War I and the highly successful Black Swan class of World War II. With anti-aircraft and anti-submarine capability. Rigging. A sloop-of-war was quite different from a civilian or mercantile sloop, which was a general term for a single-masted vessel rigged in a way that would today be called a gaff cutter, though some sloops of that type did serve in the 18th century British Royal Navy, particularly on the Great Lakes of North America. In the first half of the 18th century, most naval sloops were two-masted vessels, usually carrying a ketch or a snow rig. A ketch had main and mizzen masts but no foremast, while a snow had a foremast and a mainmast but no mizzen. The first three-masted sloops appeared during the 1740s, and from the mid-1750s most new sloops were built with a three-masted rig. Brig sloop. In the 1770s, the two-masted sloop reappeared in a new guise as the brig sloop, the successor to the former snow sloops. Brig sloops had two masts while ship sloops continued to have three. In the Napoleonic period, Britain built huge numbers of brig sloops of the cruiser class and the Cherokee class. The brig rig was economical of manpower, and when armed with carronades they had the highest ratio of firepower to tonnage of any ships in the Royal Navy. The carronades also used much less manpower than the long guns normally used to arm frigates. Consequently, the cruiser class were often used as cheaper and more economical substitutes for frigates. In situations where the frigate's high cruising endurance was not essential, a carronade-armed brig, however, would be at the mercy of a frigate armed with long guns, so long as the frigate maneuvered to exploit its superiority of range. The other limitation of brig sloops vis-a-vis post ships and frigates was their relatively restricted stowage for water and provisions, which made them less suitable for long-range cruising. On the other hand, their shallower draft made them excellent raiders against coastal, shipping and shore installations. Bermuda sloop. The Royal Navy also made extensive use of the Bermuda sloop, both as a cruiser against French privateers, slavers, and smugglers, and also as its standard advice vessels, carrying communications, vital persons and materials, and performing reconnaissance duties for the fleets. Bermuda sloops were found with gaff rig, mixtures of gaff and square rig, or a Bermuda rig. They were built with up to 3 masts. The single-masted ships, with their huge sails, and the tremendous wind energy they harnessed, were demanding to sail, and required large, experienced crews. The Royal Navy favoured multi-masted versions as it was perennially short of sailors at the end of the 18th century, and such personnel as it had, particularly in the Western Atlantic, received insufficient training. The longer decks of the multi-masted vessels also had the advantage of allowing more guns to be carried. Classification. Originally a sloop-of-war was smaller than a sailing frigate and was outside the rating system. In general, a sloop-of-war would be under the command of a master and commander rather than a post-captain, although in day-to-day use at sea the commanding officer of any naval vessels would be addressed as captain. A ship sloop was generally the equivalent of the smaller corvette of the French Navy. The name corvette was subsequently also applied to British vessels, but not until the 1830s. American usage, while similar to British terminology into the beginning of the 19th century, gradually diverged. By about 1825 the United States Navy used sloop-of-war to designate a flush-deck ship rigged warship with all armament on the gun deck. These could be rated as high as 26 guns and thus overlapped third-class frigates, the equivalent of British post ships. The Americans also occasionally used the French term corvette. History. In the Royal Navy, the sloop evolved into an unrated vessel with a single gun deck and 3 masts, 2 square-rigged and the aftermost fore and aft-rigged. Steam sloops had a transverse division of their lateral coal bunkers in order that the lower division could be emptied first, to maintain a level of protection afforded by the coal in the upper bunker division along the waterline. In the second half of the 19th century, successive generations of naval guns became larger, and with the advent of steam-powered sloops, both paddle and screw, by the 1880s even the most powerful warships had fewer than a dozen large-caliber guns, and were therefore technically sloops. Since the rating system was no longer a reliable indicator of a ship's combat power, it was abolished. Together with it the classifications of sloops, corvettes, and frigates. Instead, a classification based on the intended role of the ship became common, such as cruiser and battleship. Revival. During the First World War, the sloop rating was revived by the British Royal Navy for small warships not intended for fleet deployments. Examples include the Flower classes of convoy sloops, those designed for convoy escort, and the Hunt class of minesweeping sloops, those intended for minesweeping duty. The Royal Navy continued to build vessels rated as sloops during the interwar years. As they were not intended to deploy with the fleet, sloops had a maximum speed of less than 20 knots. A number of such sloops, for example the Grimsby and Kingfisher classes, were built in the interwar years. Fleet minesweepers such as the Algerine class were rated as minesweeping sloops. The Royal Navy officially dropped the term sloop in 1937, although the term remained in widespread and general use. World War II. During the Second World War, 37 ships of the Black Swan class were built for convoy escort duties. However, the warship standards, construction and sophisticated armaments of the sloop of that time did not lend themselves to mass production, and the sloop was supplanted by the corvette, and later the frigate, as the primary escort vessel of the Royal Navy. Built to mercantile standards and with simple armaments, these vessels, notably the Flower and River classes, were produced in large numbers for the Battle of the Atlantic. In 1948, the Royal Navy reclassified its remaining sloops and corvettes as frigates. 2010s. The Royal Navy have proposed a concept, known as the future Black Swan class sloop-of-war, as an alternative to the global corvette of the Global Combat Ship Program. Notable sloops. Perhaps the most famous sloop was HMS Resolution, in which Captain James Cook made his second and third Pacific voyages. This was not a purpose-built naval sloop, but was a former merchant collier purchased by the Royal Navy and adapted for exploration purposes. Cook called Resolution the ship of my choice, and the fittest for service of any I have seen. Us Independence, a sloop of the Continental Navy which served on diplomatic missions to France. Independence was the first ship acquired by the Continental Congress for use during the American Revolutionary War. She captured 2 British prizes during her cruises to Europe. In 1780, HMS Vulture, a Swan-class sloop bearing 16 6-pounders and a crew of 99 seamen, delivered Major John Andre to his meeting with General Benedict Arnold, near Haverstraw, New York, to finalize plans for Arnold's surrender of West Point to the British. After Andre's capture and the unmasking of the plot, Arnold fled to British lines, borne down the Hudson River aboard Vulture. HMS Beagle, a Cherokee-class brig sloop rigged as a 3-masted bark, is famous as the ship Charles Darwin sailed around the world in between 1831 and 1836. In 1804, Commodore Sir Samuel Hood commissioned Diamond Rock, a small island south of Fort de France in Martinique, as HM sloop-of-war Fort Diamond. Following his establishment of a fortified garrison on the rock, In 1805, HMS Pickle brought back news of the British victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. In 1800 and 1801, Lord Cochrane commanded HMS Speedy, a brig sloop of 14 guns, through a series of famous exploits in the Mediterranean. Speedy served as the inspiration for the fictional Jack Aubrey's first command, Sophie, a Seagull, a United States Navy sloop-of-war which was captured by the British in Canadian waters. Later she was liberated by the U.S. Navy at the Battle of Lake Champlain. In 1813, HMS Raccoon was dispatched to Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River during the War of 1812 to seize the post, which as it turned out had already been sold to the Northwest Company. The fort was renamed by the ship's captain Black as Fort George. Wasp, a U.S. Navy sloop which served with distinction during the War of 1812. She is responsible for sinking or capturing at least 4 British warships and capturing several other merchant vessels. This within months of her commissioning and before her own sinking during a Caribbean storm in October 1814. In 1826, Carteria, acting as a warship of the Navy of the First Hellenic Republic under the command of Captain Frank Abney Hastings, was the first steam warship to see action. At the time the European armadas had no steam warships. Portsmouth, a U.S. Navy sloop-of-war which served during the Mexican-American War in the California Campaign. She participated in combat during the Second Opium War, specifically the Battle of the Pearl River Forts. Later she served in the American Civil War, at the Battle of Forts Jackson and St. Philip. In 1843, Austin, flagship of Commodore Edwin Moore, and vessel of the 2nd Texas Navy, and was a participant in the naval Battle of Kamchatka, which is the only historical example of a sail navy having defeated a steam navy. Constellation, an 1854 sloop which is currently a museum ship. It was the last all-sail warship designed and built by the U.S. Navy. Kearsarge, an 1861 steam sloop-of-war best known for defeating the Confederate commerce raider CSS Alabama in a duel off the coast of Cherbourg, France in June 1864. HMS Starling, commanded by Captain Frederick John Walker, participated in the sinking of 14 U-boats between 1943 and 1944 as part of the 2nd Escort Group. In 1949, HMS Amethyst, a Black Swan-class sloop of the Royal Navy, became involved in an international incident when she became trapped in the Yangtze River by communist Chinese shore batteries. She made a famous escape on 30 July 1949, later turned into a feature film, Yangtze Incident. The story of HMS Amethyst.